In the deepest trenches of the world's oceans, where sunlight has never touched the seafloor and the pressure would crush a human body in an instant, something immense moves through the eternal darkness. It is a creature so vast, so alien, that for centuries humanity dismissed it as nothing more than the fevered imagination of terrified sailors. Yet in the black depths where no man was meant to venture, this monster has been hunting, breeding, and thriving for millions of years, growing to sizes that defy comprehension. This is not a tale spun from fantasy or Hollywood imagination. This is the story of how humanity's oldest maritime nightmare crawled from the realm of myth into the harsh light of scientific reality. For over 1,000 years, sailors whispered of the Kraken, a beast so enormous it could be mistaken for an island, so powerful it could drag entire warships to the bottom of the sea with its writhing tentacles. They spoke of eyes the size of dinner plates glowing in the depths, of arms thick as ship masts that could snap a vessel's spine like kindling. The learned men of science dismissed these accounts as superstition, the product of minds addled by months at sea and too much rum. They catalogued the testimonies alongside reports of mermaids and sea serpents, filing them away as curiosities of human delusion. But the sailors knew what they had seen. In the cold waters off Norway, in the treacherous passages near Greenland, in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, something was down there. Something that watched them from below with ancient, intelligent eyes. What those early mariners could not have known was that their monster was real. It was not a demon or a dragon, but a creature of flesh and blood, sinew and bone. A living nightmare that had evolved in the crushing depths to become one of the most magnificent and terrifying predators our planet has ever produced. The Kraken was not a myth. It was a giant squid. But this revelation, when it finally came, would prove to be only the beginning of an even more extraordinary story. For as science began to pierce the veil of the deep ocean, researchers would discover that the reality of the giant squid was far stranger and more wondrous than any legend could have imagined. They would find creatures that dwarfed the largest dinosaurs, engaged in battles with whales that represented some of the most epic predator-prey encounters in the natural world, and possessed abilities that seemed to border on the supernatural. The journey from myth to scientific fact would span centuries and cost countless lives. It would require the development of technologies that could withstand pressures equivalent to having an elephant standing on every square inch of their surface. It would demand new ways of thinking about the ocean itself, forcing humanity to confront the humbling truth that we knew more about the surface of Mars than we did about the depths of our own planet. This transformation from folklore to scientific reality began in the fjords and coastal waters of medieval Scandinavia, where the first written accounts of the Kraken appeared in the works of Norwegian chroniclers. These early descriptions painted a picture of a creature so massive that sailors could mistake it for land itself. A living island that would suddenly reveal its true nature by disappearing beneath the waves, creating whirlpools that could swallow ships whole. The Danish bishop Erik Pontoppidan, writing in the 18th century, provided one of the most detailed early accounts of the beast. He described a creature so enormous that its body, when it surfaced, resembled a collection of small islands. According to his sources, the greatest danger to mariners was not the creature's aggression, but its very size. When the kraken dove back into the depths, it would create such powerful currents and whirlpools that any ship caught nearby would be dragged down into the abyss. These accounts were not the ravings of simple fishermen or the tall tales of drunken sailors. They came from experienced sea captains, naval officers, and respected members of maritime communities. Men whose livelihoods depended on accurate navigation and careful observation of ocean conditions were reporting encounters with something that challenged everything the natural philosophers of the day believed about marine life. The creature they described possessed characteristics that seemed to belong more to the realm of mythology than biology. Tentacles that could reach across the width of a harbor, a body mass so enormous that it could be seen from miles away. Intelligence that seemed almost human in its calculating malevolence. Eyes that burned with an otherworldly light in the darkness of the deep. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the creature's apparent ability to appear and disappear at will. Ships would encounter what appeared to be a new island, complete with beaches and vegetation, only to watch in horror as the entire landmass suddenly sank beneath the waves. The psychological impact of such encounters on the crews was profound. How could a man trust his own senses when the very earth beneath his feet could prove to be the back of some unimaginable sea monster? These reports began to follow a consistent pattern that suggested something more than mere superstition. The encounters typically occurred in deep, cold waters. The creatures were described as having multiple arms or tentacles. They were associated with sudden changes in water conditions, from calm seas to violent turbulence, and they were universally described as being far larger than any known sea creature. As maritime trade expanded and more ships ventured into previously unexplored waters, the reports multiplied. From the North Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Arctic waters to the Southern Ocean, sailors were encountering something that defied classification. The creature had many names in many languages. The Norse called it the Kraken. The Greeks spoke of the mighty Scylla with her writhing arms. Japanese fishermen told tales of the Akorokamui, a massive octopus-like spirit that dwelt in the depths. The consistency of these reports across different cultures and time periods suggested that humanity was encountering something real, something that lived in the deep ocean and occasionally rose to the surface. But what exactly was this creature? How large could it truly be? And why did it seem to appear only in brief, terrifying glimpses before vanishing back into the depths? The answers to these questions would not come from the observations of sailors or the theories of natural philosophers. They would emerge from a new and rigorous approach to understanding the natural world, an approach that demanded physical evidence, careful measurement, and repeatable observation. The age of scientific inquiry was beginning to dawn, and with it would come the tools and methods necessary to transform the Kraken from a creature of legend into a subject of legitimate biological study. But the transition from myth to science would not be swift or simple. It would require decades of painstaking research, the development of entirely new fields of marine biology, and most challenging of all, the courage to venture into the deepest and most hostile environments on our planet. The hunt for the Kraken was about to begin, and it would take humanity to places darker and more alien than any medieval chronicler could have imagined. The breakthrough that would finally drag the Kraken from the realm of legend into the harsh light of scientific scrutiny came not from the depths of the ocean, but from the shores where the sea surrenders its secrets. It began in the winter of 1857, when the tides of the North Atlantic deposited something extraordinary onto the beaches of Denmark. The remnants were grotesque and alien fragments of something so large that even in pieces they defied comprehension. A Danish naturalist named Japetus Steenstrup stood over these remains with the careful eye of a man who understood that he was looking at history itself. What lay before him was not the stuff of sailors' tales or medieval bestiaries. It was flesh and blood, cartilage and sinew. Most importantly, it was a beak. A massive curved hook of keratin that belonged to no known creature on Earth. This single piece of evidence, this fragment of nightmare made manifest, would become the cornerstone upon which an entirely new understanding of the deep ocean would be built. Steenstrup was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was a scholar of the natural world, trained in the rigorous methods of scientific inquiry that demanded proof over speculation. But as he examined this enormous beak, measuring its dimensions and studying its structure, he came to a conclusion that would have seemed impossible just decades earlier. This was not the remains of some unknown whale or shark. This was the feeding apparatus of a cephalopod, a squid of such immense proportions that it dwarfed every known species by orders of magnitude. The implications were staggering. If such a creature existed, if the ocean harbored squid of this size, then the sailors' accounts of the Kraken were not the products of fevered imagination or maritime superstition. They were glimpses of a real animal, a living giant that dwelt in the deepest waters of our planet. Steenstrup gave this creature a name that reflected both its magnificence and its mystery. He called it Architeuthis dux, which translates to the most important squid leader. It was a name that acknowledged not just the creature's size, but its significance as the ruler of a realm that humanity had barely begun to understand. But a single beak, however extraordinary, was not enough to convince the skeptical scientific community of the day. The learned men of Europe's universities had spent centuries dismissing the accounts of mariners as folklore and superstition. They would not abandon their position based on a fragment of evidence from a Danish beach. What Steenstrup needed was more proof, more specimens, more pieces of the puzzle that would definitively establish the reality of his ocean giant. Fortune would favor the persistent. In the years that followed, the sea began to yield more of its secrets. Along the coasts of Newfoundland, Norway, and the British Isles, fishermen began to haul in nets containing pieces of creatures that matched no known species. Tentacles as thick as a man's torso covered in suckers the size of dinner plates. Fragments of mantle tissue that suggested bodies of impossible dimensions. Eyes that even in death seemed to stare with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Each new discovery added another piece to the growing body of evidence. The creatures were not confined to any single region of the ocean. They were global in their distribution, lurking in the deep waters of every major sea. They were not small aberrations or evolutionary curiosities. They were giants, true titans of the deep that possessed all the characteristics the sailors had described in their terrifying accounts. The scientific community began to take notice. Museums across Europe started to collect and preserve these specimens, building the first systematic catalog of giant squid remains. Researchers began to study their anatomy, their physiology, their evolutionary relationships to other cephalopods. What they discovered was a creature perfectly adapted for life in the deep ocean, possessing abilities that seemed almost supernatural in their sophistication. The giant squid's eyes were the largest in the animal kingdom, each one the size of a dinner plate and capable of detecting the faintest traces of bioluminescence in the eternal darkness of the deep. Their tentacles were not merely strong but intelligent, equipped with thousands of suckers that could taste and feel their environment with extraordinary sensitivity. Their beaks were capable of tearing through the toughest flesh, while their bodies could change color and texture in ways that would make them nearly invisible in their natural habitat. But perhaps most remarkably, these creatures possessed a level of intelligence that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about invertebrate cognition. Their brains were complex, their nervous systems sophisticated, their behavior suggesting a degree of problem-solving ability that was unprecedented in the cephalopod world. These were not mindless sea monsters. They were thinking, calculating predators with cognitive abilities that might rival those of marine mammals. As the evidence mounted, a new picture began to emerge of life in the deep ocean. The giant squid was not an aberration or a freak of nature. It was the apex predator of one of Earth's largest ecosystems, the master of a realm that covered more than half of the planet's surface. The abyss was not the empty wasteland that scientists had imagined. It was a thriving world of unimaginable complexity, populated by creatures that had evolved in isolation for millions of years. The hunt for living specimens became the obsession of a generation of marine biologists. If these creatures were real, if they were as large and as intelligent as the evidence suggested, then observing them in their natural habitat would represent one of the greatest achievements in the history of natural science. But the challenges were immense. The giant squid lived at depths where the pressure would crush conventional equipment, in waters so cold and dark that survival seemed impossible for anything not specifically adapted to such conditions. Traditional methods of deep-sea exploration proved woefully inadequate. The bright lights and noisy engines of submersibles seemed to frighten the creatures away long before researchers could observe them. The giant squid appeared to be extraordinarily sensitive to disturbance, vanishing into the darkness at the first sign of human presence. They were like ghosts of the deep, leaving behind only tantalizing traces of their passage. The few encounters that did occur were brief and frustrating. Researchers would catch glimpses of massive tentacles disappearing into the gloom, or find evidence of recent feeding activity. But the creatures themselves remained elusive. It became clear that finding the giant squid would require not just advanced technology but a fundamental understanding of how these creatures lived, hunted, and communicated in their alien environment. The breakthrough would come from an unlikely source, from studying not the giant squid itself, but its prey and predators. Marine biologists began to realize that the deep ocean was not a collection of isolated creatures, but an interconnected ecosystem where every species played a crucial role. To understand the giant squid, they would need to understand its place in this complex web of relationships. The most crucial clue to understanding the giant squid's place in the ocean's hierarchy came not from observing the creatures themselves, but from studying their most formidable adversary. In the stomachs of sperm whales, researchers began to find something extraordinary. Hundreds of indigestible beaks, each one belonging to a giant squid, each one telling the story of an epic battle fought in the crushing darkness of the deep. These discoveries revealed one of nature's most spectacular conflicts. A war between titans that had been raging in the abyss for millions of years. The sperm whale, the largest toothed predator on Earth, was locked in an eternal struggle with the giant squid, and the evidence of their battles was written in scars across the whale's massive body. Circular marks, perfectly spaced, told the story of tentacles wrapped around flesh in desperate combat. But these were not the marks of a one-sided hunt. The giant squid was fighting back and fighting hard. Some sperm whales bore scars that suggested encounters with creatures of truly monstrous proportions. Sucker marks the size of dinner plates arranged in patterns that spoke of tentacles thick as tree trunks. These were not the wounds inflicted by some cowering prey animal. These were the battle scars of a predator that refused to surrender without a fight. The implications were staggering. If sperm whales, creatures that could dive to depths of over 6,000 feet and hold their breath for more than an hour, were engaging in life and death struggles with giant squid, then these cephalopods were not the passive drifters that some scientists had imagined. They were active, aggressive predators capable of taking on one of the ocean's most formidable hunters in single combat. This revelation transformed the scientific understanding of deep-sea ecology. The abyss was not a quiet realm of scavengers and filter feeders. It was a battlefield where some of the largest creatures on Earth engaged in conflicts that dwarfed anything seen on land. The giant squid was not hiding in the depths because it was weak or defenseless. It was there because that was where it ruled, where it had evolved to become the perfect killing machine for an environment that would destroy most other forms of life. The evidence painted a picture of creatures so perfectly adapted to their environment that they seemed almost alien in their capabilities. Their bodies were boneless, allowing them to squeeze through spaces that would trap any vertebrate. Their skin could change color and texture in milliseconds, providing camouflage so perfect that they could become virtually invisible against any background. Their tentacles were equipped with hooks and suckers that could grip with the strength of industrial machinery, while simultaneously tasting and analyzing everything they touched. But perhaps most terrifying of all was their intelligence. Unlike other cephalopods, which were known for their problem-solving abilities and complex behaviors, the giant squid possessed a brain of enormous size and sophistication. This was not a mindless predator driven by instinct alone. This was a thinking creature capable of strategy, planning, and perhaps even a form of consciousness that humans could barely comprehend. The hunt for living specimens became more urgent as researchers began to understand just how remarkable these creatures truly were. But every attempt to observe them in their natural habitat ended in failure. The giant squid seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to detect human presence, vanishing into the darkness long before cameras could capture their image or instruments could record their behavior. The problem, marine biologists began to realize, was not with their equipment but with their approach. They had been thinking like surface dwellers, bringing the bright lights and mechanical noise of the human world into an environment that operated by entirely different rules. The deep ocean was a realm of bioluminescence and silence, where creatures communicated through patterns of living light and detected their prey through the most subtle changes in water pressure and chemistry. The breakthrough came from studying the very language of the deep itself. Researchers discovered that the ocean's depths were alive with bioluminescent communication, a complex system of signals that creatures use to find mates, warn of danger, and coordinate hunting strategies. This was not the random flickering of primitive organisms. This was a sophisticated network of biological light that connected every living thing in the abyss. Dr. Edie Widder, a marine biologist who had dedicated her career to understanding bioluminescence, realized that the key to finding the giant squid was not to impose human technology on their world, but to speak their language. She developed a revolutionary device that could mimic the bioluminescent displays of deep-sea creatures, essentially creating a lure that would be irresistible to the ocean's greatest predators. The device was elegant in its simplicity. Known as the electronic jellyfish, it reproduced the panic response of a common deep-sea jellyfish, a spinning pinwheel of blue light that served as a distress call in the darkness. This was not just any signal. It was the oceanic equivalent of a scream for help, a beacon that would attract the attention of any large predator within hundreds of feet. The theory was brilliant. When a jellyfish was attacked by a smaller predator, it would create this bioluminescent alarm to attract an even larger predator that might attack its attacker, giving the jellyfish a chance to escape. It was a strategy that had evolved over millions of years, refined by the harsh mathematics of survival, in an environment where being eaten was a constant threat. But would it work on a creature as intelligent and sophisticated as the giant squid? The answer came in the summer of 2012, in the deep waters off the coast of Japan, after decades of failed attempts, after countless expeditions that had returned empty-handed. The electronic jellyfish finally succeeded where every other method had failed. The footage that emerged from that expedition would change everything. For the first time in human history, a living giant squid was captured on film in its natural habitat, and what the cameras revealed was even more extraordinary than anyone had dared to imagine. The creature that approached the bioluminescent lure was not the sluggish, passive animal that some scientists had theorized. It was a hunter of incredible grace and power, moving through the water with a fluid elegance that seemed to defy its enormous size. The giant squid in the video was unlike anything that had been seen before. Its skin shimmered with patterns of color that shifted and changed as it moved, creating a hypnotic display that spoke of intelligence and awareness. Its tentacles moved with purpose and precision, investigating the strange light with what could only be described as curiosity. And its eyes, those massive orbs that had been described in sailors' tales for centuries, reflected the camera's lights with an intelligence that was deeply unsettling. This was not a monster in the traditional sense. This was something far more complex and mysterious. The giant squid revealed itself to be a creature of profound beauty and alien intelligence, a being so perfectly adapted to its environment that it seemed to belong to another world entirely. Its movements were poetry written in flesh and sinew, its very existence a testament to the incredible diversity and complexity of life on our planet. The video lasted only minutes, but those minutes contained decades' worth of scientific revelation. Researchers could see how the creature moved, how it investigated potential prey, how it used its tentacles to explore its environment. They could observe the subtle changes in coloration that suggested complex communication or emotional states. They could witness firsthand the grace and power that had made this creature the stuff of legend for over 1,000 years. But perhaps most importantly, the footage revealed that the giant squid was not alone. The success of the electronic jellyfish suggested that these creatures were more common than anyone had imagined, living and hunting in the deep waters of every ocean on Earth. They were not mythical beings or evolutionary aberrations. They were a successful and widespread species that had mastered one of the planet's largest and most challenging environments. The revelation that giant squid might number in the millions came as a shock to both the scientific community and the general public. These creatures that had seemed so rare and mysterious were actually thriving in the depths, hidden from human observation by the simple fact that their world was so alien and inaccessible to surface dwellers. This discovery opened up entirely new questions about the nature of life in the deep ocean. If giant squid were common, what else might be living in the abyss that humanity had never seen? What other titans roamed the deep waters, carrying on their ancient struggles far from the eyes of the surface world? The ocean, it seemed, still held secrets that could humble human understanding and challenge everything we thought we knew about life on Earth. The discovery of living giant squid was only the beginning of a far stranger and more terrifying tale. As marine biologists celebrated their triumph over one of the ocean's greatest mysteries, the deep began to yield evidence of something even more extraordinary. In the frigid waters of the Southern Ocean, in the ice-locked seas around Antarctica, researchers began to encounter traces of a creature that made the giant squid look like a minnow by comparison. This was not another species of giant squid. This was something entirely different, something that challenged every assumption scientists had made about the limits of life in the deep ocean. The first clues came from the stomachs of sperm whales hunting in Antarctic waters. Among the familiar beaks of giant squid, researchers found something that defied classification. Beaks that were not just larger but fundamentally different in their structure and design. These were not the elongated, curved beaks of giant squid. These were massive, robust feeding apparatus that spoke of a creature built for an entirely different kind of predation. Where giant squid beaks were designed for speed and precision, these belonged to something built for raw, overwhelming power. The creature that possessed such weapons was not content to hunt the swift prey of the mid-water zones. It was designed to crush and devour the largest fish in the Antarctic seas. The first complete specimen of this new titan was hauled up in the nets of a New Zealand fishing vessel in the year 2003. What emerged from the depths was a creature so massive and alien that even seasoned marine biologists struggled to comprehend what they were seeing. This was the colossal squid, Messenicotuthis hamiltoni, a creature that would redefine humanity's understanding of what was possible in the natural world. The colossal squid was not simply a larger version of its giant cousin. It was a completely different kind of monster, evolved for a completely different kind of warfare. Where the giant squid was built for speed and agility, the colossal squid was constructed like a living siege engine. Its tentacles were not just equipped with suckers, but with rotating hooks, sharp as razors and strong as steel. These were not the feeding apparatus of a creature that relied on stealth and surprise. These were the weapons of something that could take on the largest predators in the ocean and crush them through sheer, overwhelming force. The psychological impact of this discovery on the scientific community was profound. For decades, researchers had thought they were closing in on the ocean's greatest secrets. The giant squid had been found, filmed, and studied. The mystery of the Kraken had been solved. But the colossal squid revealed that the deep ocean still held terrors that dwarfed anything in human mythology. This was not just another large squid. This was evidence that the abyss harbored creatures that operated by rules humanity had never imagined. The anatomy of the colossal squid spoke of adaptation so extreme they seemed to belong to science fiction rather than biology. Its eyes were not merely large, they were the largest sensory organs ever recorded in any animal, each one the size of a car tire and capable of detecting movement in the absolute darkness of the Antarctic depths. Its body was not streamlined like that of the giant squid, but massively built, with layers of muscle that suggested strength beyond calculation. But it was the creature's feeding strategy that truly set it apart from every other known predator. The colossal squid was not a hunter of smaller prey. It was specifically evolved to take on the giants of the Southern Ocean, the massive Patagonian toothfish that could weigh hundreds of pounds and measure over 6 feet in length. These were not delicate, graceful prey. They were robust, powerful fish that required a predator of extraordinary capability to subdue. The hooks that lined the colossal squid's tentacles were not simply larger versions of the suckers found on other cephalopods. They were rotating, three-dimensional weapons that could penetrate the toughest flesh and then lock in place, making escape impossible. Once these hooks found their target, there was no breaking free. The victim was held fast while the colossal squid's massive beak, larger and more powerful than any known in the cephalopod world, went to work. The discovery of the colossal squid forced marine biologists to confront an uncomfortable truth about their understanding of deep-sea ecosystems. If such creatures existed, If the Southern Ocean harbored predators of this magnitude, then what else might be living in the unexplored depths? The ocean covers more than 70% of the Earth's surface, yet humanity had explored less than 5% of its volume. The remaining 95% was an alien world that might harbor creatures beyond the wildest dreams of mythology. The evidence suggested that the deep ocean was not just populated by giant cephalopods, but by entire ecosystems of monsters. The battles between sperm whales and colossal squid represented conflicts on a scale that dwarfed anything seen on land. These were not the quick, decisive hunts of terrestrial predators. These were prolonged wars of attrition fought in an environment where the slightest mistake could mean death. The psychological horror of these encounters was amplified by their setting. The deep ocean was not merely dark, it was a realm of crushing pressure and bone-chilling cold where sound traveled in strange ways and the very water itself seemed to press in from all directions. It was an environment that would kill a human being in seconds. Yet it was here that some of the most spectacular predator-prey relationships on Earth played out in their terrible glory. The colossal squid's discovery also revealed something deeply unsettling about the nature of evolution in isolated environments. Cut off from the surface world by thousands of feet of water and millions of years of separation, the creatures of the deep had evolved along paths that seemed to follow different rules entirely. They had grown to sizes that defied the normal constraints of biology, developed sensory abilities that bordered on the supernatural, and evolved feeding strategies that seemed designed by some malevolent intelligence. And so we return to where we began, to the eternal darkness of the deep ocean where the Kraken still dwells. The ancient mariners were not mad. The medieval chroniclers were not spinning tales of fantasy. They had glimpsed something real, something that science has now confirmed lurks in the abyss in numbers that stagger the imagination. The monster of their nightmares was not a demon or a dragon, but something far more extraordinary. It was life itself, evolved to perfection in a realm where humanity was never meant to venture. The Kraken is real and it is magnificent.